Hello. The school holidays have come to an end and it's getting back to normal life. So here we are resuming the Conquered and the Proud lecture series. And I'm changing things a little bit from the original talks I used to give as part of a course I taught some years ago, to add a little bit of detail where I think it helps for the more general audience. Now, August didn't prove to be the Augustus month that I'd intended. Things got in the way and I didn't have enough time to prepare this, but in many ways, although August is of course named after Caesar Augustus, he tended to celebrate September. He used the Capricorn as his symbol, and a lot of the key events, particularly of his early life, occurred in September, so that's my excuse. We'll continue on, and we're looking at the rise of Augustus, and we'll edge towards the creation of the Principate, although that's something that we'll need to cover in more than one session. And we'll also have, later in the month, we'll have the question and answer video from all the many questions that have been sent in, and I suspect actually we'll end up doing more than one of those because there's plenty of good ones that have come in that are worth doing and worth talking through. We'll do some more on the HBO Rome series. We'll do another episode of that, and we'll fit in some thematic ones. I might look at something about Mark Antony the soldier, because that's something that there are too many stereotypes, simplified views of Mark Antony as the very capable as well as very enthusiastic military man, and I think that owes a lot to his own myth-making more than reality, but it's something that obviously you see in the HBO series, but you see in Shakespeare, you see in movies like Cleopatra, the old Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor one, of the marked contrast between Augustus, the rather frail, quiet, cold individual, a calculating politician, rather than the gruff, simple, straightforward man of action, Mark Antony. Neither of those stereotypes is true. We've already done the session on Augustus in the army that talked a little bit about this, but we'll talk more today about his rise and the bits of his career that don't fit into the image that he later took such care to craft around himself and his family. So we'll be looking at that, but we've got to remember that although Augustus is of key importance, he doesn't quite get the attention of later generations. If you think the HBO Rome series covers the rise of Augustus, there have now and again been mini-series and the like about him as emperor, but they tend to simplify things. In I Claudius, he's the old man, there at the start of the story to set things up, but he's being outwitted by the far more cunning Livia. We rarely see the middle period of Augustus's life and the period of key change for Rome and for the wider world, because he did so much. But think, this is someone who doesn't get a Shakespeare play. You have Julius Caesar, though he's murdered in Act 3. You have Antony and Cleopatra. He's in both of those. He appears as Caesar in Antony and Cleopatra. He's Octavian, I think, in Julius Caesar. I can't quite remember, it's been a while since I've looked at them. He's there, he's one of the key characters, but he isn't the subject. He's not the hero, the tragic hero of either of them. He's the one who's still there standing at the end of it. And one of the big problems is, of course, as far as drama is concerned, is that Augustus lives to a ripe old age and dies in his bed, whereas Julius Caesar is spectacularly murdered in a meeting of the Senate. Mark Antony tries to stab himself, doesn't really make a good job of it, then will die in the arms of his lover Cleopatra. It's hard to beat that from the point of view of drama, but obviously, from most sensible human points of view, it's rather better to live on longer and die surrounded by success, surrounded by your family, and having lived a long and very full life. But because he does that, he's less dramatic, gets less attention, he's just far more important. And you have to remember as well, something we'll come back to a little bit, he is only 18 on the Ides of March 44 BC when Julius Caesar is murdered. This is someone who, by today's standards, is on the borders, the fringes of being an adult. He might be starting off in a job or a career, he might be about to go to college. When I taught university students, I used to point out that he would usually, Augustus, when this started, when he first steps onto the political stage, was younger than anybody in the room, even though they are brought up and still very much think of themselves as kids. these are different times, but nevertheless what he did was exceptional, even for this generation. And of course he's someone who cultivates his image so carefully that although he's the first man to appear on every coin, Caesar had appeared on some, Augustus, or symbols of Augustus, are there on all of them. His image was absolutely everywhere in the Roman world. When in the Gospels, Jesus asks to be shown a coin and whose head is on the coin, Caesar's, the probability is, just statistically, that rather than the current emperor of the time, Tiberius, the head would actually be that of Augustus, because so much currency was minted in his very long reign and remained in circulation for a long time afterwards. But it's an image that never grows old. He is this clean, handsome, youthful hero. Not quite an Alexander, but there are elements of that. There are elements of many other things, but he doesn't age. There are images of Julius Caesar showing the receding hairline, the lines on his face. They exaggerate that to make him sort of craggy, determined, the sort of rugged Hollywood hero. Augustus doesn't age at all. So even though people, if they actually met the emperor in his latest years, would have met this little old man with a poor complexion, rather bad teeth and losing his hair, that's not what most people saw. That's not what most people would think of when they thought of Augustus, because the image was of this perpetually youthful and almost angelic, almost sort of more than human individual. Now those are all things we'll come on to, probably not so much today, but in some of the later talks, and then perhaps in the future, because again, Conquered and the Proud, while I'm trying to expand it and look in reasonable depth into some aspects of the thing, we're still covering 200 years of history in a relatively short time, so we're going to have to skim over a lot of things. Think of it as a more detailed introduction than, say, some of the introductions I've given in the talks on individual books. And of course, in the case of Augustus, I've written about him, I've written a biography, but I've also done the biographies of Caesar, of Antony and Cleopatra, where he figures, particularly in the Antony and Cleopatra, because he's a key player in their stories as well. When Julius Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, then he appears, he's not even in Italy, he's over there on the other side of the Adriatic, in Greece, at Apollonia, being educated, being trained. Caesar was planning to take him on at least some of this 3-year Eastern expedition that he'd planned. We don't entirely know what role he was supposed to have, but that's where he is. So he isn't there in Rome. Not that he would have mattered. He hasn't any political status beyond the fact that he is connected with Caesar, but there are a few other relatives around, similarly fairly distant. He doesn't have status, he doesn't have reputation, and yet he steps up, declares himself to be a leader, a major player, and turns that into reality in the civil wars that very soon follow. So we're going to look a little bit at that as we come through. But it's one thing that, again, is easy to forget when you remember the aged Augustus, the father of his country, the man who brought peace, stability, success, prosperity to the Roman Empire, which meant a large part of the world's population at that time. Not just the Romans, not just the Italians, but a lot of people. There is the story told by Suetonius that in his last days, as he was sailing down the coast of Italy, a grain ship coming from Egypt passes his ship, learns that Augustus is on board, and the crew and the passengers cheer him because he'd made the seas safe for them to travel. Now, exaggeration perhaps, what else are you going to do when the emperor turns up? You're not going to blow a big raspberry if you know what's good for you, but nevertheless, there was enthusiasm, there was relief. He did turn the empire into something that was successful and a system that would last for centuries. And for the first 200 years or so after that, I was going to say the qualification is there, but largely avoided civil war. There's about a civil war every century. Now that doesn't sound great, but it is marvellous compared to what's been happening in the 1st century BC up until Augustus is the last man standing, and what is going to happen in the 3rd century and later, when Rome is just not really free of civil war until quite well into the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman period. And even then the risk is always there because there are so many precedents for the violent overthrow of emperors. But his system works, and he is this elder statesman, this calming influence, this moderate, this cautious man. He's also, of course, a conqueror, and we'll look at that in more detail in one of the later sessions when we look at Augustus and the empire, Augustus and the provinces. But his rise to power is exceptionally bloody. This is a young man who earns a reputation for cruelty. There's talk of how ready he was to pass capital punishment on people when he was dispensing justice. So it was the moriendum esse, they must die, again and again. He is, of course, involved in the proscriptions. You get this in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Antony, Lepidus and Octavian are drawing up the death lists and trading off favours for, well, if I'm going to have your relative, if you're going to have my relative, I'll have one of yours, or somebody you like. These that then must die, their names are pricked. Pretty much how things seem to have happened. There was this trading off of favours, and two of you dislike this man, so he's got to go. They kill hundreds of people. Not all the people on the proscription lists are caught and killed. Some do manage to get away, and some eventually are pardoned, but an awful lot do. It's a period of great brutality, and this is not the only period the only phase of his life, even though this is the initial violence. 4 years afterwards, this is someone who earns a reputation for excessive cruelty, for the great enthusiasm with which he murdered his rivals, his defeated enemies, he confiscated their property. Now all the triumvirs are doing this, Antony and Lepidus as well. There is this strange Roman feeling that because he's so young, he shouldn't really have so many enemies at this stage, so that there is extra cruelty, and that perhaps youth ought to be a little bit more naive, a little bit less bitter. Again, that's a thought, but bear in mind, when you're young, you can hate very strongly, the same as you can do everything else very strongly. Not that that doesn't mean that older people can't do exactly the same thing. This is a brutal period. It's massacres, it's civil war. He was not likable at that period. He was not popular, partly because he ended up taking control of Italy, where most of the really dirty jobs, when it came to Roman citizens, had to be done. Now, that was important and an advantage politically, but it was also very, very damaging to his reputation. Nobody likes the chancellor and a governor who comes in, raises taxes, stops spending, even if those things are necessary, and even if looking back people can say that was the right thing to do. It's never a nice job. It's never one that's likely to win you much favour at the time. And there is that tendency, and of course this is something that I try to avoid in the book, that you do this bloody rise to power and then you sort of flick a switch and he becomes the old man, the elder statesman, beloved by everybody, outwitted by Livia, getting into I Claudius country. Scholars tend to know what happens in between, but in the more general audience, in history enthusiasts, less tends to be known about the middle years of Augustus' life. Now we'll try and look at those as we go along, either today or in the next talk. But it's really important. As I say, this is a big, big difference, and I can't remember whether I mentioned this or not when we were talking about Caesar, but one of the reasons why the name Caesar turns from being simply a family name, go back to Julius Caesar, I'm not king but Caesar, not a Marcius Rex, I'm a Julius Caesar, is because of Augustus. Caesar's dictatorship was brief. There were the Julian laws, the Julian colonies, there was his image appearing on coins, but it didn't last very long and he's murdered. None of that would have had the lasting impact had it not been for Augustus to appear and take the name of Caesar, be Caesar's heir, and be so successful politically. So one of the reasons why the name Caesar becomes synonymous with power, why you get a Kaiser in Prussia and Germany, a Tsar in Russia in 1900, is because of the success of Augustus, turning what Julius Caesar had started into something different, but something far more permanent. And to that point where successive emperors, even when there was not the slightest relation by blood or even adoption with Augustus and his family, let alone Julius Caesar, took the name Caesar, took the name Augustus. Why this would last it reminds me of when they were producing what they call pre-proofs, which are the not quite fully corrected version of a book that they sometimes send out to reviewers early, or at least they used to. It's getting less common these days, everything tends to be digital, of my biography of Caesar. I think one of the researchers had sort of gone onto Google and tapped in images of Caesar and got hundreds and hundreds of pictures of statues, busts, the like, and decided that, oh, that's a nice face, so let's send it out. So the thing actually went out with haven't looked at it a while. I think it was a bust. It was either Gaius or Lucius, I think, Augustus's grandsons, came into the thing, and then another one was going to go out with one of Augustus. So that was simply because someone without a background in Roman history just thinks Caesar, or every Caesar is going to be Julius Caesar, and of course it just doesn't work like that. But again, you have to know that little detail. Now, fortunately, they checked, but they also checked after they'd sent out these review copies. So I had to work on the basis that most of the reviewers probably knew me or knew who I was and didn't think that I'd make a mistake as bad as that. So everyone was nice about it. Nobody made any comments, but it was deeply embarrassing because, it's so obvious. You look at it and that's not Julius Caesar. So there is a tendency in the attempt with the biography, which I won't be able to go into in as much detail in these talks, but the biography is there if you're interested in my take on the things, trying to understand the real Augustus, the man who develops during this long political career, this long life, who is this young, blood-stained warlord in a civil war, in a period of chaos, who is utterly ruthless and openly so, turns into the middle-aged stabilizer, the man who brings peace, creates a new system, gets the state, restores the republic, as he boasts, res publicae, and boasts about this on the res gestae, the deeds of Augustus that are set up in inscriptions outside his mausoleum in Rome, and in copies elsewhere, often by temples, cult sites to the divine Augustus, a cult that starts a little bit, though with limited official approval, during his lifetime, and then takes off when he is formally deified after his death. But he is something of a mystery. He is a hard man to pin down, partly because of the sources, and one of the other reasons why this middle period of his life tends to get ignored is because the sources are extremely poor. We don't have the detailed narrative that we've had for earlier on. Even the surviving books of Dio are very, very brief, and Livy doesn't exist for that period, so you don't get really good narrative history, and there are times when you're not quite sure what's going on and where everybody is at a particular year. Suetonius' biographies, so it's useful, but often he doesn't date many of the anecdotes, and rather like Herodotus and others, and many a historian, ancient and modern, he can't resist putting in a good bit of gossip, even if he doesn't really believe that it happened, but it's too good a story to miss out. It perhaps isn't a coincidence that one of Augustus's seals, and he had several for different tasks, different types of correspondence, but one of them was the Sphinx. The notoriously opaque, impossible to read creature with its riddle, but also that sense of mystery about it. Now, it's a common enough thing to choose. There are plenty of other reasons why he might have done that, and he might simply have had a ring that he rather liked and an image he rather liked as a seal. But that is one of the things. It is very hard to pin Octavian, the young Caesar, Augustus down and know why he's doing things, and also know why he acts in those ways, how much he changes, how much he develops. Now, I remember talking about this and saying, aim of the book was to try and get the real Augustus, and somebody pointing out that, what is the real anybody? We all are play acting. I think with Augustus there is a very conscious theatrical element to his life, and his public life in particular, and the extension of the private life that is shown to people. Now, that's true of most, if not all, politicians, but it's particularly pronounced in the Roman system, and Augustus was very, very good at it. And like many an actor, you watch them on stage, on screen, you are convinced that they are that person, at least enough to buy into the story. With a politician, again, their own image can take over, and they can end up almost as a caricature or parody of themselves. The way the impressionist presents them starts, and the cartoonist, you start to see more and more, and it reinforces when you see them, you're thinking of those things. So Augustus is a mystery, but let's look at his rise. Let's look at this early part of the career and consider again the sheer surprise everyone would have felt at the success of this man, because he really did come from nowhere. And his father, Gaius Octavius, had been a moderately successful senator. He appears to have been the first man of his family to go into politics. There are rumours, scurrilous rumours, he'd been involved with spreading bribes around to influence voting in the Comitia Centuriata in the assemblies at Rome. Maybe, maybe not, moneylender. The problem is you never quite know with this muck that is thrown at politicians how much of it is accurate. Some of it might be, but we don't really know. He married, in a sense, above himself, but then he marries Attia, the niece of Julius Caesar, moderately important senatorial family, good connections, but again we have to remember that Julius Caesar is someone who is fighting against the fact that his family has fallen to the fringes of Roman politics for generations, and it's another branch is starting to make a comeback before Caesar's own career begins, but he's very much making his own way. He is a patrician, he can claim descent from the goddess Venus, that he had ancestors back there with and before the foundation of Rome. He'll claim to be descended from the kings of Alba Longa, all this sort of thing, but it wasn't of actual value at the time beyond this vague sense of, oh yes, I come from a very distinguished family. Caesar had to rise on his own merit, his own skill, his own manipulation of the political system, almost like a new man. Not quite, but almost. He wasn't born with the consulship ready and waiting for him. Octavius is described as a man of wealth and good reputation, but there's nothing exceptional. He seems to have a fairly standard career. He gets elected to the praetorship. 61, he's sent off to govern Macedonia, but he then dies comparatively young. He dies before he's old enough to stand for the consulship, but he also dies before the Civil War, so he isn't forced to take sides during that disruptive period. The man the baby who'll become Augustus is born in 63 BC. It's ironic, really, that it's at the same time as the Catilinarian conspiracy. So someone whose career will be based around civil war and commanding an army and fighting his way to power is born around about the same time as a coup, and his father would have been in the Senate debating what to do with the Catilinarian conspirators that have been captured. Not as a major player, not as a major speaker, but nevertheless he was there as someone who is getting elected office and is, still at a comparatively early stage of their career, but doing okay. There is no sign that Julius Caesar devotes particular attention to the young Octavius. In 51 BC, when the young Octavius Augustus is, just coming into his early teens, his grandmother, Julia, the sister of Julius Caesar, dies, and he provides the funeral oration at her public funeral. Now, this is an aristocratic funeral, so there's a great show made. It's partly because Caesar is away. He's off there in Gaul. There isn't another closer male relative, and it's always been this good way of introducing an up-and-coming, the next generation, in a sense, to the public eye, giving them this public role at an occasion which draws at least some attention. Just how big a funeral this was, difficult to say, although, again, the Roman aristocracy is all related to each other, so the probability is they're keeping quite a close eye on this sort of thing, and that plenty of people will attend, even as with some modern funerals of public figures. They feel they ought to, but also in private life there's that sense of obligation. You might be there to represent someone in your family who genuinely knew the individual, even if they're now too old, too frail to get there. So he's starting to have some role in public life. He gets a little bit more. He gets a few minor roles during Caesar's dictatorship. He's too young to take part in the Civil War. He was summoned to the Spanish campaign in 45 BC, but fell ill on the way and didn't get there in time to take part. He arrives when it's all over. He's not the only distant male relative of Julius Caesar. He's Caesar's great nephew. He is shown a little more favour and presumably represented, or Caesar perceived him as showing more talent than the one or two others. He is named as the principal heir in Caesar's will. However, bear in mind, nobody knew this other than Caesar and anyone else with whom he confided. Wills were not made public in the sense, in a normal way, to say you're my heir. The other point to remember is that unless Caesar's health was considerably worse than even the few fragmentary sources that suggest he was in decline make out, then Caesar wasn't expecting to die anytime soon. So a will need not necessarily be your final will and testament. This is the provisions he's made for the moment, and he bequeaths the bulk of his property, and property includes not just land, money, investments, but also the obligations that clients have to you. So it's some of his status, and it's also his name. He would become Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, as was normal. These are quite common provisions in will. He is his principal heir. He would be a wealthy man. He would have the money, the family name that might allow him under normal circumstances to have start off and have a decent career. But it's not more than that, and it was not adoption. Later, Augustus, Octavius, will claim that it was, and will have himself retrospectively adopted by Julius Caesar. There isn't any precedent for that in Roman law. This is deeply questionable, but when you control the troops that are controlling Rome, you can pretty much do what you like and get away with it. Nobody's going to stop you, nobody's going to take you to court. But there is no hint that this was Caesar's intention. Now, whether it might have been after Caesar had taken the young Octavius off with him on his eastern expedition, maybe he would have got a sense of, this kid seems to be good, he's learning, he's understanding, he's good with people, he's good with soldiers. The basic problem is we don't know what Caesar's long-term plans were, and as I've said in previous talks, there is so much propaganda that came out in the years after Caesar's assassination, whether to justify the act of the conspirators or from Caesar's supporters or those trying to rally Caesar's former supporters, to say that look at all the wonderful things and the good things Caesar would have done had they not murdered him. It's very hard to know the truth, and it's quite possible that Caesar himself hadn't finally decided. It all depends on his health, his expectations, and those unknowable things. Just what did he want to happen? Was he going to do, whilst he may have criticised Sulla for retiring from the dictatorship and public life, Caesar may have expected to go on and then die, but not to have been succeeded by somebody else with similar power. Or perhaps he did. We simply do not know. So this is the situation. Caesar's been murdered. It takes a matter of days for the news to reach the young Octavius over there in Apollonia, the other side of the Adriatic. He also learns at the same time that he is named as Caesar's heir. Now, that's not really a dangerous thing. The conspirators have made a great point of not killing anybody other than Julius Caesar. For Brutus and Cassius, this has been the whole point, that we will cut off the head of the problem, we'll cut off the dictator, but they're not going to murder Mark Antony, they're not going to murder anyone else. Cicero, time and again, retrospectively, blames them for not having bumped off Mark Antony at the same time, because Antony's become such a problem. Antony is consul, another consul takes over Dolabella, he and Antony don't get on, but nevertheless this is another major player at the time. You have Lepidus, who'd been Caesar's master of horse, has authority over troops, although again, you feel this would probably lapse once Caesar's been murdered, but nevertheless the troops are there and they're willing to obey him. The conspirators have misread the situation really in almost every respect. They've shocked the Senate rather than saved the Senate. Once Caesar's dead, well, there's not much point standing up and saying that was terrible. So plenty of senators show a good deal of approval, they are welcomed, but the next few days they spend hiding up on the Capitol, holed up, guarded by a troop of gladiators paid for and hired by Decimus Brutus. The wider reaction of the rest of society is in no way enthusiastic. The liberty that Brutus and Cassius proclaimed is very much the liberty for the senatorial class to go on and exploit the provinces and monopolize senior office, wealth, prestige, all of these things. They're not really promising anything or doing anything for everybody else. The rest of society should know its place and just be grateful that now senators are bickering for power and competing for power and getting elected, or at least that's what should be happening, in a way that couldn't really happen when everything was effectively controlled by the dictator. You have, of course, famously the speeches made in the forum to informal gatherings of whoever chose to turn up. First of all with Brutus, and while the Shakespearean speeches given to Brutus and Mark Antony probably don't reflect in that much detail what was actually said by either man, though there are different versions, particularly of Antony's speech, as to just the tone he had. I think they're one of the best representations of the power of oratory in the Roman world that you have in the English language, particularly Antony's speech. But there is that sense, I think Shakespeare probably did capture the naivety, to an extent, of Brutus, that he thought, well, it's a difficult decision for me, but I did it because it's what I felt was right for Rome. But he isn't able to inspire people, partly because the Rome he considers significant is very much his own small class of wealthy, established aristocratic families, and that's really who've been most offended by the sheer existence of Caesar as dictator. He makes his speech, it doesn't do very well. Mark Antony then changes the mood completely, and the talk in Shakespeare obviously of the honourable men, but Brutus is an honourable man, so are they all honourable men. The character assassination he does that way is so very effective. Quite how he did it is, as I say, varies depending on the sources. He also had this wax image of Caesar's body that they sort of raised up on some sort of scaffold almost, to be able to rotate, where they had all the wounds marked. This was the unkindest cut of all in Shakespeare. Most people seemed to have felt that Caesar had actually been doing quite a good job, because the state had started to work again in a way it had not for years, and in many respects for decades. And the civil war had been fought between aristocrats for their own pride, their own prestige, their own reputation. Caesar, just as much as everyone else, he'd fought to defend his dignitas, his status, his position in the world. That didn't have huge appeal beyond the aristocracy and some of their connections. There were people who'd rallied to each side of the passion. There were an awful lot of others who just got caught up in this war. And of course, it means death, it means devastation, not just to Italy, but all the way around the Mediterranean world. And you have to take a side. That was the big problem. Caesar was nicer than many, saying, well, if you want to stay neutral, I won't count you as an enemy. But Pompey and Cato and others were inclined to see you as just that. If you're not for us, you're against us. They've already had a taste of this devastation, and they don't really want more. And Caesar, even if they didn't think he was perfect, was offering them some sort of stability, some sort of release, some sort of peace. He'd also done a lot of things that were extremely popular. His redistribution of land, his reorganization of how the state works. These were dealing with issues that have been considered to be a problem for a long time, that he'd touched on throughout his career. Whether or not Caesar was sincere is something no one will ever know, but he had continually championed many of the causes that were important to a wide section of Rome's population. And although he hadn't always succeeded, he'd got them something during his consulship, he'd got them more during his dictatorship. He did seem to have more than simply his own self-interest in mind. And the same extended to his treatment of provincials. Yes, he was a brutal conqueror, but he also brings in the Julian law restricting and regulating the behaviour of provincial governors and trying to stop them exploiting the provincial population in the appalling way that quite a lot of governors had done in this period. So instead of being hailed as heroes by all of Rome and everybody being relieved, and again this naive sense that you feel Brutus in particular felt that you could kill Caesar and then everything would just fall back into place. The functioning of the Republic would go on as it had without a dictator. You'd have normal elections, you'd have everything going on. Though I suspect he and Cassius were not planning on giving up the consulships they'd been promised by Caesar in the future. They were already praetors. So, again, there's always these Roman politicians. They're talking about liberty, they're talking about saving the state, but they are going to be the leaders of that state. They're ambitious men as well because they're Romans, because they're aristocrats. But it doesn't have this mass appeal. And very quickly there's rioting, you have the burning of houses, the lynching of a man just because he's got the same name as one of the conspirators that you have. I'm Sin of the Poet in again in Shakespeare, all coming from Plutarch. It's all there, it's in Plutarch, it's in Appian. Rioting breaks out, the conspirators become unpopular, their attempts to do deals with the Senate don't really work, they start leaving. Decimus Brutus has a provincial command to go to, the others start to go out to, they flee from Rome, they're not able to stay there. They are hoping that people like Cicero, who are now more and more enthusiastic, will be able to control things for their favour, but it's very uncertain. Antony is a big factor, nobody quite knows what he's going to do. He's dined with Brutus and Cassius, so has Lepidus. Lepidus and Cassius are married to sisters of Brutus, so there's family relationships going on there as well, because this is the Roman aristocracy. It doesn't last. Very quickly Antony gathers more and more power and starts to muster troops, starts to bring back some of the legions that Caesar had been gathering for his planned expeditions, brings them back to Italy. In April, the young Octavius Augustus arrives and announces that he wishes to inherit all of Caesar's rank and privileges. So he takes the being made the principal heir as far more. He's starting to talk as if he is Caesar's full heir, Caesar's son, almost right from the beginning. Now bear in mind, Caesar had been dictator, Caesar had been awarded all these different powers, privileges. These are not things that you can bequeath to someone in the Roman system. Office was allocated to you by, well, the authority of the people, usually by election, and then reinforced by the Senate to allocate provinces and extend imperium and all this sort of thing. Many of the honours had been voted to him by formal vote of the Senate, sometimes then approved, rubber-stamped by one of the popular assemblies. So he can't do that, but he turns up claiming that that's exactly what he wants to do. And he is significant, and it's interesting, Cicero's letters from these months give an idea of how it's rather a shock. This kid has turned up and is matters because he's got all this money, or at least he should have all this money. Mark Antony is actually withholding quite a lot from it, but he's getting backing from many of the key men, the financiers, the men who'd backed Caesar. You could talk about them as a party, but as long as you remember, these are in Roman terms. So it's very much a group associated with an individual leader rather than a cause, who are very angry because that leader's been murdered. Even some of the ones that didn't feel the dictatorship was a good idea still didn't feel Caesar deserved what the conspirators had done. So in June 44 BC, so it's just couple of months on, Cicero writes that in Octavianus, now that would be the proper name for an adopted son. It's keeping your old name but given the Ianus ending. The young Octavius Augustus never uses that. From the time he returns to Rome, he calls himself Caesar, and Octavianus would be on the end is dropped. Brutus is rather like that in a different way, in that he keeps the name Brutus even though he's been adopted by Servilius Caepio. Brutus was a more prestigious name, therefore he keeps that and uses that to remind you of his old family. Now obviously in the case of Octavius, his old family is not famous, and Caesar by comparison is the great hero, the great conqueror, the dictator. So he prefers that. His status relies upon this. Antony will dismiss him as a boy who owes everything to a name, and there is a fair degree of truth in that, but he does have more to it. He is able to use the power of that name, the influence. Anyway, Cicero goes on. There is plenty of sense and plenty of spirit, and it looks as if he will be as well disposed to our heroes, the conspirators, as we could wish. Yet how far can we trust anyone of such an age, such a name, such an inheritance, and such an upbringing? His stepfather, whom I saw at Astora, thinks he is not to be trusted at all. Even so, we must keep an eye on him, and at the very least keep him away from Antony. Stepfather is Marcus Philippus, because Attia, within about a year, 18 months of the death of Gaius Octavius, has remarried. It's something people tend to forget, but it's again fairly normal. It's a good relationship for the families involved to help promote their political influence opportunities. To what extent this is organised and arranged by Caesar, it's certainly probably not done with in a way that he's hostile towards, but it's also we shouldn't see this one person's in control of everything. It's something that there isn't space to. He rarely gets a mention. The idea that there is a stepfather, a man in the household, is something that doesn't fit with drama, in the same way that Shakespeare has no room for Cleopatra's children. It just doesn't fit in the story of doomed romance. If you look at the HBO Rome, there's no room for a stepfather. Attia has to be the big player, the one in control, or trying to be in control, rather than dependent on a husband. But aristocratic women tended to remarry. They usually had to have achieved quite a lot before their family would let them just live on with their wealth and do their own thing. Because again, the value of these political alliances was so important. And, she's a comparatively young woman at this stage. There's no reason why she shouldn't. Earlier on, round about 46, 45, so during the dictatorship, and again, while Caesar is not necessarily in Rome for much of the time, the young Octavius had already moved out of the family house. So he was no longer living under the roof of a stepfather, and he'd moved to a flat when he was sort of 16, 17ish, this sort of thing, but not long before he gets sent away by Caesar. So there's this tradition that he's lived independently. He's starting to assert himself as an aristocrat in his own right, not simply the son or stepson of somebody else. And there was always that thing, although in many cases there might be a good relationship with a stepfather, it didn't change your link with your older family, that you were the descendant of the Octavian in that case, you were their latest representative, and of course now he's moved up a rank by being a Julius Caesar. And it's round about this time you get all the talk about, what a good-looking young man he was, and how, although he was very pious and liked to go to temples to make offerings, he had to be very careful because there were a lot of these randy middle-aged women were out looking for young lovers and a bit of fun, and they had their eye on him. There is a tradition, we always associate Mark Antony as the sort of very randy, oversexed individual. Something of that reputation is at least talked about and claimed for the young Octavius. Now, whether that is simply as a response to the contrast with Mark Antony, the womanizer, the manly man, or whether it's true, it's that sort of old, I don't think it's so much true now, but you feel a few decades ago a French president had to, even if they didn't actually want them, had to pretend to have mistresses and affairs and all this sort of thing because it was expected. Very difficult to know. There are lots of these fragments, and there's so much conscious myth-making surrounding every aspect of his life that it's always hard to know. But it's worth bearing in mind because it helps explain some of what happens later on. And it also helps just to question that simplistic image of, Antony the soldier, Octavius as the very cold, very calculating, cynical politician. Now, he's arrived, and when he first appears, Cicero has his doubts about him. Obviously he's saying, do we really want another Caesar around? We've just murdered one. But Cicero's big worry is Mark Antony. He comes to loathe Mark Antony far more bitterly than he'd ever disliked Julius Caesar. Caesar was at least someone he could entertain, could talk to, they could discuss literature, philosophy, ideas, a pleasant companion. Even if Cicero didn't like what he'd become or what his power represented and what that meant for the state. Mark Antony he sees as a vulgar, vicious monster. And there's a very basic personality clash. Antony is a heavy drinker, likes hanging around with actors, actresses, has affairs with them, this sort of thing. He's not Cicero's type of person. There's clearly a basic personality clash as well as any political aspects to it. And even, his style of oratory is much more florid than Cicero's, and at one point it talks about Antony vomits words out, as usual, in the meeting of the Senate. There's a sense of him just sort of spewing forth all this stuff, rather than the much more controlled, modulated style of a proper orator like Cicero. Now, Octavius arrives, he claims he accepts the inheritance, accepts the name, so from now on he and all his friends insist upon the name Julius Caesar. He's Gaius Julius Caesar. Octavianus is ditched. They don't talk about it. Only his opponents, only his critics talk about that. And he says from the beginning that he intends to succeed to Caesar's position. That's, going to raise a few eyebrows. That's why people like Cicero aren't so convinced, aren't so sure about him. However, he doesn't show immediate open hostility to conspirators. Cicero is at least able to convince himself that, okay, maybe, perhaps because Antony is withholding a lot of Caesar's estate, Antony is doing his best to take on the loyalty of Caesar's former soldiers, Caesar's former partisans, all this sort of thing. Again, party's probably pushing it too far, but it's that sort of thing. Just use the term with caution. So he appears, he tries to make friends with people like Cicero. He's very flattering, very attentive to Cicero and others and other key players. He's doing what a Roman politician should. But bear in mind, he's 18, just turns 19 in the summer of 44, and he shouldn't be doing this. The only precedent for someone of this age is Pompey back in the Sullan Civil War, and that precedent will become more and more clear as the months pass. He does start to get support from some of Caesar's former soldiers, some of his officers, financiers. In November of 44, he gathers a group, marches to Rome. It's not really a formal army at this stage. It's a group of followers, semi-armed, semi-organized, goes into the forum, makes a speech making it abundantly clear that he intends to inherit Caesar's position. So not simply his name, not simply his fortune, he wishes to be supreme in the Roman state. The crowd does not respond and cheer him, and his followers start to look around. They sense the mood. They can see this isn't going terribly well. His own followers start to disperse, desert him. This is if it was an attempt at a coup, it goes very badly. It's botched, basically. It doesn't succeed. He doesn't have the support that he thinks or expected, and he has to leave Rome with his tail between his legs. He still isn't really considered that important, but this changes over the next few weeks, even by the end of the year and into the start of 43, because Antony's been bringing these legions back from Macedonia and elsewhere where they were gathering for Caesar's campaigns. The early ones he's taken under his own command. However, with the money, with the name of Julius Caesar, sending agents out to the camp and offering a lot of incentives, bribes, call them what you will, to key figures, particularly centurions, tribunes, officers, that sort of thing. The young Caesar persuades 2 legions to defect to him. So 2 of these legions that Antony thought were his come over to join him. He starts to recruit more troops from among Caesar's veterans. Now, if we go back to the talk on Augustus in the army and some of the other ones I've done about the legion, bear in mind that to be a veteran soldier at this time didn't mean what it meant later, that you'd spent 25 years in the army, so were well into middle age. When service is probably about 7 years, maybe 10 years, you're dealing with people who are 30-ish, and they're still pretty hale, hearty, they are still good military material. They're not quite as old as veterans will later be. Essentially, he puts himself on the map, just as Pompey has done in the earlier civil war, by raising his own army. And Cicero and the other leaders of the Senate and the conspirators are faced with the same basic problem as Sulla was with Pompey and everybody else at the time. If you scorn the person, if you tell him to go and get stuff, try and strip his army away from him, then you've made an enemy, and an enemy that's already got an army. They're there. You can't stop them being created now, so you might as well make best use of them, because you really don't want them to go over to the other side and give, particularly the difference is that these are formed, well-trained legions backed by an increasing number of men who've been soldiers not too long before and can very quickly get back into the swing of things and provide a strong nucleus of experienced leaders, which again are vital for forming new armies, new recruits, getting them trained, getting them motivated. The Senate has raised new legions and put them under the command of the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, and are going to send them off to fight against Mark Antony, who is besieging Decimus Brutus in the Cisalpine Gaul, in the northern part of the Italian peninsula. He's holed up at a place called Mutina, and there's all sorts of interesting stories about that. They're using carrier pigeons to take messages in and out, people are swimming the river, all this sort of thing. And there are letters back and forth that are clearly getting through from Decimus Brutus. The problem is that although Hirtius and Pansa are men who've served under Caesar, are relatively experienced officers, the troops they will lead are all freshly raised, not really sure what their stake in this civil war is. Whereas Antony has well-trained, partly veteran legions that he's brought over from Caesar. To meet troops like that, experienced, confident, well-trained troops, it's a bad idea just to have conscripts, recent raw recruits, poorly trained. So it's a godsend, really, as far as Cicero and others are concerned. Along comes Octavius, the young Caesar, with a couple of legions of good troops, men that are at least the equal of Mark Antony's, and also throw ambiguity into the whole thing, and that Antony can't claim to be Caesar's heir, Caesar's successor, the man that Caesar's veterans should follow, if lots of his veterans, lots of Caesar's legions are actually following somebody else who has a much closer, partly blood claim, but also is Caesar's heir, now has Caesar's name. He goes, leads them to the north, fights a couple of battles, the main ones being at Forum Gallorum, that area, and they trounce Mark Antony. So for all his supposed experienced military reputation, now, as in many cases when Antony has supreme command, he doesn't do terribly well. And he is at his most inspiring when the army's retreating through the Alps and short of provisions, and Antony keeps men going, encourages them, inspiring them. He's better at doing that than he actually is at leading them successfully in battle. Decimus Brutus is relieved, but then there is a problem, because the young Caesar, although he hasn't been saying too much about the conspirators, still, if he's going to keep the loyalty of all of Caesar's veterans and his legions, can't really be seen to be on the side of one of the men who'd murdered Julius Caesar. Particularly one like Decimus Brutus, who'd served under Caesar in Gaul and had least excuse, in a sense. He'd done very well out of Caesar, and yet he still turns against him. Now, he'd say that was obviously on a point of honour, of morality, of what was right for the state, but nevertheless, other people didn't see it that way. Now, Cicero and others have not really taken the young Caesar too seriously, and Decimus Brutus wrote a letter to Cicero talking about how the young Caesar, Octavius, is quoting something that Cicero is supposed to have said that does really sum up the attitude that Cicero and his supporters had towards the young Octavian, that essentially, he was somebody useful for the moment, but wasn't going to be a big player, wasn't going to be a serious contender because he's too young, because he's not really that important. And he doesn't have the reputation, the status, the age, the maturity, all of the things you need to be successful in Roman politics. And he's supposed to have said this is what Decimus Brutus quotes, that you've been saying that we must laudandum adolescentum, ornandum tollendum. We must praise the young man, decorate him, discard him. And Decimus Brutus goes on saying, well, he's saying he's got no intention of being discarded. Cicero doesn't deny that he said this, and it has that marvellous ring of Ciceronian oratory. It's a good tagline. But obviously, if you're planning on basically employing someone as a tool, using them to help you destroy what you consider to be a more dangerous enemy, praising them in the meantime, and then quickly getting rid of them when they're no longer necessary, then you don't go about telling everybody that's what you're going to do. You keep quiet about this because clearly, it's quite understandable. He doesn't want to be discarded, and he feels that he's proved himself. And one of the other factors that alters the whole balance is that both Hirtius and Pansa have died during the fighting. One during a battle, one of his wounds. Now, obviously, this is desperately convenient for Octavius, who effectively finds himself commander-in-chief of the entire army. His own legions plus the recently conscripted ones that have now got some victories under their belts, so are starting to be more formidable, more useful, but they're also, this is the main force in Italy, because Antony's been chased away. You've still got Lepidus. And this is when you get the formation of the second triumvirate, because realizing that his days are numbered, now he's no longer so useful, the young Caesar, and he'll become Augustus, it's, as I say, you really ought to call him Caesar at this time, but I know that's confusing because we always think of Julius Caesar when we say the name, but it's harder to make sense of the way the politics works if you don't realize that that's the key thing. He is now the Caesar. He does a deal with Lepidus and Antony. They negotiate, they agree to share power. They will be triumvirs republicae constituendi, so they'll take the title used by Sulla and to some extent by Caesar, dictator to restore the state, and a board of three to restore the republic. They announce as they're marching south with their combined armies. Decimus Brutus has by this time has tried to flee, been taken prisoner by some Gauls, handed over, and is dead. So he's the first big player amongst the conspirators to fall. Brutus and Cassius by this time have fled from Italy. They've gone to the eastern Mediterranean and they're raising armies there. And they very quickly start behaving exactly like Octavius, the young Caesar, Lepidus, Mark Antony, the other warlords of the time. They promise their troops lots of money, they bribe them, they extort money from the provincial communities to pay for this war effort, and anyone who opposes them is brutally suppressed. There are attacks on roads, there are mass enslavements. Because as far as they're concerned, they have the moral right, they are the liberators, they are the men who saved the state, and they must do more to save that state. Saving Rome, preserving liberty is what mattered, and anything is a price worth paying for that. But very quickly they degenerate. They start minting coins with their images on them, and images of a freedman's camp and the daggers of the assassins. So the whole thing becomes very muddied, very blurred quickly. The triumvirs, Lepidus, Antony, and young Caesar, head to Rome. They have the proscription list. Cicero will be one of the victims. Famously, he's either killed whilst looking out of a carriage, trying to see if they're being pursued. His head and his hand are nailed up on the speaker's platform in the forum by a vengeful Mark Antony, who's, wants the hand that wrote and the mouth that delivered the Philippics, these vitriolic speeches against him, to meet their end, be shown to be humiliated as well as killed. It is very brutal, and even compared to the Sullan proscriptions, there's an awful lot of death, there's an awful lot of people ending up on the proscription list who don't necessarily have anything to commend them for this other than the fact they have money and the conspirators need money, the triumvirs need money to pay their armies. You have this rather cynical quote from Velleius Paterculus talking later. Where are we? All right, I've got this somewhere. Yes, here we go. One thing, however, demands comment, that toward the proscribed their wives showed greatest loyalty, their freedmen not a little, their slaves some, their sons none. A whole literature develops of terrible ends, betrayals, and salvation of people on the proscription lists, of the woman who manages to smuggle her husband in a trunk into the presence of the triumvirs, and they're forced to spare him because the crowd, this is where during a public entertainment, is shows just loves her spirit, loves what she's done, and thinks this is great, she's got away with it. You have a long inscription known as Laudatio Turiae, in praise of Turia, this wife who's died, set up by her husband, and one of the things she's done is gone to Lepidus and suffered a beating because she's begging for him to be pardoned and repealed. Again, not everybody dies. Some do escape, but there are lots of stories of people having sons having affairs with their mothers and or their stepmothers rather, and getting rid of the father. Of betrayals, as I say, Velleius Paterculus emphasises that sons that are just desperate to get their hands on a share of their father's money. So better that than all of it, but because if they can have it now, getting rid of him. This is extremely brutal. Again, though, remember, there is no evidence at all for the killing of women and children during the proscriptions. That's the sort of thing that will only happen under the rule of the Julio-Claudians when there's, say, the coup of Sejanus or people like that. This is killing adult men. And that's terrible, but it shows that there's an element of the republican system, the traditions of the aristocracy, that imposes restraint. You don't do this sort of thing to women, you don't do it to children, you only do it to grown-ups, to men that supposedly can protect themselves, or obviously they can't. Plenty will flee abroad, plenty will escape. Obviously they'll be rushing to the Brutus and Cassius, joining them because and they're welcomed. Sextus Pompeius, the younger son of Pompey, starts to build up power for himself based around a fleet that marauding, raiding, but quite formidable in battle, based around Sicily, some of the other islands, in trying to rescue people who are on the run, this sort of thing. And again, there's the, it plays in, it allows the other side to show just how brutal the opposition are. But their attitude is, and the public pronouncement by the triumvirs is, that Julius Caesar pardoned his enemies and they murdered him. So we're not going to make the same mistake. You've got to prove your loyalty to us. But it is an extremely brutal time. And this leads into more than a decade, really, of on and off civil war, which again spreads all the way around the Mediterranean. There's a lot of death, and because of this, there's also a lot of confiscation of property, of land. You have poets like Propertius talking about the friend that they can't mourn properly and can't bury because his body just disappeared. You have Virgil, in the early 30s BC, lamenting the loss of ancestral farms. Ah, shall I ever, long years hence, look again on my country's bounds, on my humble cottage with its turf-clad roof? Shall I, long years hence, look amazed on a few ears of corn, once my kingdom? Is an impious soldier to hold these well-tilled fallows, a barbarian these crops? See where strife has brought our unhappy country. There's a constant theme in the poetry of this period, in Virgil and Horace and Propertius, of the horrors of civil war and the costs of it all, because even if you didn't take a side, you might find that your property was confiscated by a warlord who needed to reward his troops and his officers with land, with estates. There is great upheaval at this time. We haven't really got time to go into the full narrative of the civil wars themselves. Essentially, it breaks down into phases. You have the first big conflict is when Antony and the young Caesar, Octavius, go off to Macedonia to fight against Brutus and Cassius. Now, Pompey had gone to Macedonia to raise troops, the idea that he'd build up his strength and wait for the enemies to come to him didn't work for him. It doesn't work for Brutus and Cassius. It gives seeds initiative very quickly to the other side. Now they've drawn on the resources of the eastern provinces. They have very large armies. There's talk of armies of almost 20 legions on each side fighting in these campaigns. These are probably not anything like full strength, but you're still dealing with armies that are twice the size of the clash at Pharsalus and things like that. This is much bigger. They're probably lower quality, and there are probably far more understrength legions than there are, because that allows you to give lots of commissions for tribune, for centurion, for all of these things. And it sounds great. If you've got commanding 19 legions, even if they're quite weak numerically, that sounds a lot better, more prestigious than commanding 8 nearly full strength ones. There are 2 battles of Philippi. In the first one, Brutus wins and defeats the young Caesar's men, storms his camp, and Cassius is defeated by Antony. One of those little details you get in Plutarch, get in Shakespeare. He's short-sighted, he can't see properly, and he mistakes cavalry coming from Brutus to tell him that they've won for men sent by Antony to pursue him, and gets his Parthian slave to help him commit suicide. At least that's the story that's told. The slave disappears, which you can't blame him doing. Whether he waited for the order or whether he anticipated, who knows. Octavian has to deal with this. There's claims that he wasn't in camp, that he was ill, he'd been warned by a prophecy, so it wasn't really his fault. But nevertheless, Antony gets the main glory, because in the second battle, Brutus is defeated. There have been lots of manoeuvrings, lots of it's a bit like Dyrrhachium, it's a bit like Alesia in a sense, lots of building of siege works, trying to outmaneuver, cut the other off from water, from supplies, all this sort of thing. And these are battles spread over a couple of weeks. Brutus commits suicide in the aftermath of his defeat in the second battle. Again, Shakespeare, Caesar now be still, I killed not thee with half so good a will. Using, ironically, the same dagger he'd used to stab Julius Caesar, and this sense, of tragedy. And then, of course, in Shakespeare, he's the noblest Roman of them all. The defeated liberators' men are supposed to have hailed Antony as victor, but scorned the young Caesar. It's very much. This is probably Antony's biggest military triumph. And it's a major achievement. This is a large-scale operation, though it should also be remembered he's fighting against not very experienced leaders with rather mediocre, ill-trained troops. So it's a clash of poorly trained armies. It's quite like a lot of civil wars in their early stages. You've got quantity over quality, and everybody's trying to learn what they're doing as they go along. So sometimes you can get a reputation early on that doesn't necessarily bear through and carry on in the rest of your career, and that'll be the case with Mark Antony. He takes over administration of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The young Caesar goes back to Italy. Again, Italy, as I say, is something of a poisoned chalice because it's important politically, but you have to do all the dirty jobs. You're the one who's evicting farmers so you can give their farms and their estates to your supporters, your men. He does this effectively, but it doesn't always make him very popular. During these years, there will be problems caused by Sextus Pompey blockading the coast of Italy, stopping supplies get through, so you get periods of food shortages in Rome. There will be friction with Lepidus that eventually leads to his army deserting him to join the young Caesar. There will be a serious conflict with Sextus Pompey, which takes a long time to win and requires aid from Mark Antony with the names of ships, but also it's where you start to see Agrippa, whom we'll talk about far more when we come on to the provinces, becomes to a great extent the young Caesar's right-hand man, who helps to train the fleet before they take on Sextus Pompey's men. And there's talk of them training on benches to learn to row on land, so that before they actually get let loose on the ship itself with proper oars. It's proper preparation. Agrippa is one of these people who seems to be able to turn his hand to anything and get it done. An immensely practical, efficient man who comes from an even more obscure family than the Octavii, and who gets these positions of authority because the young Caesar trusts him. They seem to be about the same age. They've partly been educated together, and they're friends. They do trust each other and they work very well. And it's part of that sense where Octavius, the young Caesar, begins to realize his own limitations, but gets good at seeking out talent and using talent, and particularly talent where they can't really be a rival. Their achievements will be given to you, awarded to you, because you're the Caesar, you're the man of the distinguished name, and they're not. And they're happy with that because it's good for them as well. They're getting opportunities they'd never get otherwise. And maybe they believe in him as well, and maybe they believe in what they're doing. It's hard to tell. You have the falling out with Mark Antony's brother Lucius Antonius, backed partly by Antony's wife Fulvia, a fascinating character that we'll talk about more another day, that leads to the siege of Perusia, where you have all these slingshots, or possibly shot from small-scale ballistas. There's a debate over that, though most go for the slingshot idea, with these slogans on of insults to each other and talking about Lucius Antonius's boldness, hitting Fulvia in the private parts, this sort of thing, even though she wasn't actually within the city, and wasn't there during the siege, but she had helped to raise soldiers. Antony rather does the dirty on her because he'll come back, and after attempts at negotiation, first of all prove a bit tricky and there's manoeuvring, eventually he'll do a deal. Fulvia will very conveniently die in despair, rather abandoned by her husband, and he will then marry Octavia, the young Caesar's sister, her husband having conveniently died. At this point, Marcellus, the former consul, leading to a sort of patching up of the alliance. They will combine together, with Antony's aid, not in person but through ships and the like, and crews. Sextus Pompey is defeated. They negotiate with him first. There's a period of stability, but then it goes back to war. During this time, the young Caesar has married 3 times, the only 3 times he will in his life, for political advantage in each case. His second wife, Scribonia, gives him a child, his only child to survive, his daughter Julia, and then he comes across Livia. Now, she's already married to somebody else. She is pregnant with her second child. She's already got the young Tiberius, and she's expecting Drusus. The young Caesar makes the husband divorce her. He is Livius Drusus, obviously. Tiberius Claudius Nero, sorry. let's get things straight. And then moves her into his household, is betrothed to her, having divorced Scribonia because she's, like an itch I can't scratch well enough. And within days of her giving birth to young Drusus, he marries her, and he makes her former husband act in the place of her father and give her away. And then it's probably then they have this feast where they dress up as Olympian gods and goddesses at a time of famine in Rome and have a roaring good time. And you have the story of one of Livia's slaves, and these sort of dwarves that were very fashionable, who used to sort of whisper and make bitchy comments basically about the people there, that was thought of as terribly sophisticated and witty, and something that Livia loved. Apparently Caesar Augustus couldn't stand them, but nevertheless, you do what you do to please your young wife. This is very strange. The whole story, the whole episode, is something that you would expect of a Nero or a Caligula, not of the cold, calculating, clammy almost Octavius, young Caesar we're used to from stage, from cinema. And yet this is what happened. And it comes back to this idea of this young womanizer, this, again, he's only in his 20s at this point, and he's within years become one of the key people, one of the most important people in the world. He's led successful wars, he's in charge, he's the boss, he's got wealth, he's got prestige, he's got power. It's probably not surprising that he gets a bit carried away and parties and enjoys himself, even when this isn't tactful. So you have rioting in Rome. You have, again, these periods of patching up. Antony visits on a couple of occasions. He seems to be more popular than the young Caesar, perhaps because the young Caesar gets more of the blame for being the man on the spot. Other rivals are basically eliminated. Sextus Pompey, Lepidus sent into. He isn't worth killing. He is left as in very comfortable imprisonment, basically, in a country villa. He's also Pontifex Maximus, and the young Caesar Augustus will make a point of not stripping the office from him, not doing this sacrilege. He waits until Lepidus dies, then has himself made Pontifex Maximus, just as Julius Caesar had been, and from then on it'll be natural for emperors until it is taken over by the Pope in late antiquity. Hence the name that's lasted through till now. The others fall by the wayside. Octavius, the young Caesar, goes off in campaigns, mainly in the Balkans, and tries to win some clean glory. Again, we've talked about this in the video about Augustus and the army. Antony operates in the east. He's humiliated when in the winter of 41-40 BC the Parthians, led partly by the son of Labienus, Caesar's old senior subordinate, who fought for Pompey during the civil war and been killed died in the aftermath of the war in Spain. One of his most determined opponents, his son, appears minting coins as if he's a Roman official, but calling himself Parthicus. Now, normally you take a name of people only if you've defeated them. He certainly hasn't done that. With Parthian aid, he helps to overrun the eastern provinces. These are largely recovered by one of Antony's legates, one of his subordinates, Ventidius Bassus. Again, interesting fellow we'll talk about another day. Wins some battles, defeats the Parthians, gets some vengeance for Carrhae. Antony plans a major expedition in 36 BC and makes a complete pig's breakfast of it. He rushes forward, distracts them, threatens the Euphrates, then does this immense march through Armenia to come into Medea the other way. It's a huge distance. It's the sort of thing you can do on a small scale with relatively limited numbers of cavalry. It's not what you can do with a huge army. Again, the tendency of the civil war with Brutus and Cassius continues the sense that all Roman armies need to be gargantuan in this period, far bigger than they ever are at any other time, but it makes them clumsy, difficult to feed, difficult to maneuver, and many of them are not very experienced soldiers. But it's this idea that some of them have got more and bound to win. He rushes ahead, lets his siege train and baggage train be wiped out by the enemy, because obviously when you're dealing with the Parthians, the Medes and others, they're highly mobile and they know what they're doing. This is a dangerous opponent. You can't take stupid chances and expect to get away with it. Antony doesn't. His siege fails because he doesn't have the equipment to do it. He then retreats. Parthians are very good at harrying a retreating army. Antony suffers much higher losses then, partly through enemy action, but then later on through fatigue, disease, lack of food. He seems to have a breakdown. He has a big problem after this. He wanted to get the glory of a major victory over foreign enemies, and one that he could say, I've done what Caesar was planning to do. And he fails. It's very hard for Antony to come back from this point, even though several years pass before the breakdown in relations. So you have Antony returns. Cleopatra will come to him on the coast of, it's roughly Lebanon these days, and sort of restore him. And you partly feel after this, and maybe it's reading too much into the sources, but you sometimes feel that he almost can't function unless Cleopatra's telling him what to do in these later years, and that she feels that, and that she's not just the brains, but the spirit behind their cause, really. In 34 BC, you have, after he's deposed the king of Armenia, who had been his ally but then had switched sides during the Parthian campaign, gets him arrested, parades him in golden chains. He sort of does this, something that can be perceived as almost a triumph, but in Alexandria rather than Rome, that feeds into the propaganda campaign that the young Caesar is building up against him, that depicts Antony as someone who's ceased to be Roman. He's fallen under the spell of this Eastern temptress who, is a barbarian who's bound to be hostile to Rome, and is an enemy. We can no longer trust Antony, therefore reluctantly we have to go and kill her or defeat her to make sure that Antony isn't a threat to us, isn't a threat to Rome. It's trying to lead people into a civil war when they really don't want one. They're fed up, and also by making it not really a civil war but against a foreign opponent. It's a gross misrepresentation of Cleopatra's career throughout her life. Again, something I've talked about a little bit, we can do more another time. But it's very effective as propaganda. It makes it easier for people to swallow the pill of, we need yet another war, because if we've got two warlords, they're bound to fight. Let's try and settle it for once and all, and maybe there'll just be one, and maybe we'll get peace at that point. This builds up gradually. In 34 BC, they also have the famous donations of Alexandria, where Antony starts giving out large parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, but also areas he hasn't occupied, like the Parthian Empire, to his own children and the children he's had with Cleopatra, his own children with his Roman wives. It's distinctly odd. It's very hard to get to the truth. It might be something that is there to confirm Cleopatra's power, as Caesarion and some of the other children are starting to approach adulthood, and then by Ptolemaic standards becoming a threat, potential rivals, potential alternatives. It may be some grandiose statement. The Romans haven't always kept everything directly administered in the East. They make a lot of use of dynasts of one sort or another. Everybody has. Pompey did it, Caesar does it, Bruce and Cassius do it, Antony does it, Augustus will do it later on. But it is distinctly odd, and it plays into the hands of the story that the young Caesar is putting together at Rome. He breaks sacred tradition law by getting Antony's will out of the temple of Vesta and reading out, no doubt, selected sections of it that imply that he has gone native, he's gone Egyptian, he just wants to be with Cleopatra. There's great stress made on when aid is sent, not the aid that he'd actually promised, but something more symbolic and prestigious. Praetorian cohort ships are sent out to Mark Antony before his Parthian expedition, taken by Octavia herself, his wife. Antony refuses to see her. Now, it might be because he's expressing disappointment with the fact he hasn't got what he was promised, not the numbers of troops overall, even though he's got some fancy elite units. But it's also seen as a snub. He's snubbed his good Roman legitimate wife in favour of this Egyptian tart, basically, this mistress. And then there's talk of she's using magic to ensnare him. You get poems from Horace and others, but where he's ceasing to be Roman. He's doing all these effeminate things. He's taking orders from eunuchs. He's sleeping under a mosquito net. A good Roman, like a good Italian, they should just let themselves get bitten. Seems to be the attitude for many of them. That's the manly way to do it. He builds up this situation, and you lead up to the War of Actium, the last civil war in 31 BC. Again, there's more to it than this, but I haven't got time to tell the whole story in detail, and it's there in the books. Antony does what Pompey had done, what Brutus and Cassius had done, build up power in Macedonia and wait for the enemy to come to him. You'd have to think that after it's failed twice in the past, that maybe you'd start to think that perhaps what Sulla did, which was use Macedonia to launch an invasion of Italy, was actually the best way of doing it. It doesn't work. Led particularly by Agrippa, the forces of the young Caesar take Antony's war effort apart. The war is largely decided before Actium. Actium seals his fate in many respects, not least because he runs away during it. And whilst people will occasionally dress this up as, oh, well, he gets away with his treasury and all this sort of thing, okay, but he's abandoned his fleet, he's abandoned his army, and no matter how much money you've got, you're not going to buy replacements for those easily. But also, he has done what no Roman aristocrat should do. He's left the field before the bulk of his troops. You might get beaten, but you're supposed to rally your men, lead them off, prepare them to fight another day. You don't quit. You claim you're going to win in the long run. Antony seems to give in, and even worse, it seems that he does it when he sees Cleopatra sailing away and he just can't be parted from her. All this sort of thing. So, again, we'll do some talks on Antony the soldier, Antony's military career, because I find that interesting, and it isn't what people expect, but we'll do those another time. There is some delay before Caesar, the young Caesar, man who become Augustus and his men, follow Antony to Egypt. So it's not until the summer, August 30 BC, when the last sputtering bits of the civil war are fought. There are some small actions, Antony wins a skirmish, but he can't do any more than that. Most of his troops desert him. You've got all this dramatic living the high life while they can, the last weeks, months of their lives. And then, of course, you have the drama of the suicides, something we'll talk about again another time, but it is notable that Cleopatra sets Antony up so that he's almost bound to flee or kill himself. And killing himself is the most likely answer. Then seems to regret it, but only once he's definitely dying. She then waits a week or more before taking her own life, trying to do a deal with the young Caesar. The problem is she's been built up to be such a bugbear in the propaganda machine that's needed her as an enemy compared to Antony the Roman that people remember with some fondness, that she can't get a deal that she would like, and therefore she takes her own life. Again, Cleopatra is somebody we can talk about more another time, because she's a fascinating figure, even if the story is quite a grim one in many respects. And again, Antony and Cleopatra, the book is out there, as well as there's plenty of other stuff written on her. So there's lots if people have more interest in this. The young Caesar is the last man standing in the civil war in 30 BC. Everybody else is dead. All the big players, all the big names have gone. The entire troops of the Roman world now are loyal to him, are taking an oath to him. That doesn't mean that everyone could see immediately that all the civil wars were over, because experience has told you that this has dominated the lives. There's nobody really left around who can remember clearly a functioning republic, because it hasn't really been functioning since before the Social War, and particularly since Sulla's day. And there have been repeated civil wars, coups, political violence, all this sort of thing. So nobody remembers that. That's become normal almost. It's now a question of, can this last man standing, and a man who's fought his way to power pretty brutally and killed a lot of people, he's climbed to power on a heap of corpses. Can he change that? Can he create a system that will last? And this will be the great achievement of Caesar Augustus, why he gets the name, it becomes so celebrated, he becomes father of his country, he gets honoured to such a degree. That's really something we ought to talk about next time, because it's a bit too complicated. So I think what we'll do is finish for today on this, which is really the rise to power, just to remind ourselves that that precedes the statesmanlike behaviour of the rest of his life. And then we'll look, probably in two sessions, we'll look at one talk where we'll look at the domestic politics, how the system's set up, the new regime, how it works, and then we'll look at the empire and the provinces, the army, those sorts of things, because it's easier to divide those, because there are major changes everywhere. And 30 BC is when he is supreme in the Roman Empire, the Roman state. He doesn't die until 14 AD. So for 44 years, this man dominates the Roman state and the Roman Empire. So there are a lot of things that we need to explain and look at if we're going to make sense of the later Julio-Claudians and subsequent emperors. So that's it for today. It's turned very much into a rise of Octavius, the young Caesar, the man who'll become Caesar Augustus, with some anecdotes and talk about everyone else. Let's finish perhaps with some words of Tacitus, writing early in the 2nd century AD. in a very cynical way, because that was Tacitus' nature. But he talks about when the killing of Brutus and Cassius disarmed the state, when Sextus Pompey had been crushed in Sicily, and with Lepidus thrown aside and Antony slain, even the Julian party was leaderless but for Caesar. Again, it emphasises that fact. He's just the last left alive. No one would have expected this 18-year-old kid with no reputation to be able to beat all these far more experienced men with greater reputations, more prestigious families. And yet he's done it. In those 14 years, everyone else has fallen by the wayside. So now, as we'll see next time, the big question is, how do you sort things out? How do you solve things? How do you give peace to an empire, and particularly a Roman citizen population that is desperate for an end to civil wars, that just wants stability, just wants to be able to wake up next week, next month, and know that their farm will still be theirs, that it won't get confiscated, and know that they won't be conscripted to fight against a leader whose cause they don't care about for another leader whose cause they don't care about. How does Caesar Augustus create the Principate and make it last? And again, that's not as simple as people make out, and it isn't automatic by any means. So that's for next time, but thanks for watching today.